Welcome to Wired AF. You're listening to your host, Brandon. I'm joined with Dr. David Raubenheimer from the author of Eat Like the Animals. It's our third book club episode, actually, and we're really excited to have an author of the book rather than just us analyzing the book. It's actually going to be exciting to have David talk about the book himself. So, David, would you like to introduce yourself to the podcast?
Yes, thanks, Brandon. I'm a professor of nutritional ecology at the University of Sydney. So what I do as a nutritional ecologist is I study the feeding habits of animals in a way that is different to standard nutritional science, in that it takes into account ecological and evolutionary aspects of feeding and nutrition. So of course, physiology is important and behavior is important as well, but all of that is studied within the context of the natural lives of animals.
Which is very different to what you see online with people who are, say, nutritionists, but don't have a really big background in biology like yourself.
Yes, it's fundamentally different. And also, one of the things that a nutritional ecology approach does is it brings a comparative perspective. So rather than studying, like many physiologists or nutritionists study a small range of species or specialize on one, nutritional ecologists typically study a wide range. And that gives you a broader perspective that helps you to understand not only the big picture, but seeing each of those species within the context of the big picture is a very powerful thing to do. That's the other part of my job at the moment, is that I am, even though I study a wide range of non-human species, I'm now using the approaches that we've developed and the information that we've accumulated and understanding from studying non-human species to better understand nutrition and its problems in our own species.
Which is really interesting perspective, because we used to hearing about people talk about, eating like your ancestors and that kind of paleo diet becoming popular out of, the last, say, 10, 20 years. Whereas you've got your book titled Eat Like the Animals, which is such an interesting title. Can you tell us about how you came up with that kind of title and how you marketed the book like that?
The title of a book is one of the most difficult things to come up with. You've got the concept, and then you've got to decide on how to basically tell the story of the book, or enough of the story of the book to attract people's attention in a few words. What Eat Like the Animals, the title refers to, is the main message of the book is that the mechanisms that non-human species use to select a healthy diet, a healthy, balanced diet, we too as a species have those same mechanisms. The problem with our species, though, is that they're in a very different environment. And Eat Like the Animals is really pointed at the message that what we've got to do is trust our biology to choose diets that are balanced and healthy in the way that non-human species do. It's not that straightforward. As we explain in the book, there are certain issues you've got to understand specifically about not our biology so much, but the environment within which that biology operates. But that's where Eat Like the Animals, the title, that's what it refers to.
You definitely succeeded with that. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think it catches a lot of people's eye when they first see it. And I know I was very, very intrigued when I first met you. We in the I think it was the Australian guidelines. And then there was a webinar about how you had brought some research in about studying different types of species into that as well. And that was very interesting.
Yeah, I enjoyed that discussion very much, because it did, it provided an important perspective on the Australian guidelines. And that is that providing information is one important aspect of helping people select healthy diets, but there's much more to it than just providing people with information on what they should and shouldn't be eating. That gets back to the title as well, because the paperback edition of the book that has just been released in the United Kingdom has got a different title. It's been called The Five Appetites. And that was a title that we considered at an early stage in writing of the book, and then they have now moved to that title. And what that title refers to is a very key aspect of our biology that we share with all species that we've studied. And that is, we don't have a single appetite. We actually have several appetites, each for separate nutrients. And this is a very powerful piece of biology, because what that means is, rather than having a body that tells our brain when we're hungry and when we must eat, what these appetites do is they're the mechanism through which the body tells the brain not only that it's hungry, but what it's specifically hungry for. Which particular nutrient does it need the most at a given time? And it's the interaction of these appetites, these 5 appetites in non-human species, and we've also now shown in ourselves, that helps them to select a diet that is balanced and satisfies the current needs of their body at any particular time. Those appetites are the appetite for protein, have a separate appetite for protein, for fats, for carbohydrates, for calcium, and for salt. But the point is that an animal, our species included, can't have too many appetites, because it makes feeding too complex. You need immense processing power, and to make the right decisions, if you've got all that information feeding into your body, it becomes a complex mess. So what evolution has done is it's equipped us and other species with appetites for those nutrients that are most critically important to get right in the short term at least. What it's also ensured is that if we follow those appetites, at least in a natural feeding environment, a natural food environment, where those appetites evolve to work for the benefit of the species concerned, if we follow those appetites, given the nature of the foods that are available in natural food environments, it means that all of the other nutrients that our bodies need are also going to come along for the ride. In effect, we're getting them for free. We're not having to select them specifically. We select the things that we do need to select specifically, we automatically get enough of the others. But that is critically dependent on what the nature of the foods are that we are selecting using those 5 appetites. If it's the wrong combinations of foods, we won't get those nutrients automatically. We won't get them in the right proportions at all. But if it's the right food environment and combinations of foods, we will.
So that's something that's really interesting, and something that's become really popular in the last maybe 10 or so years, is people counting macros and people counting those nutrients in, like, specifically, and focusing on certain things independently. And at the beginning of the book, you make it very clear how animals can do this innately, and how Stella the baboon pretty much eats a wide variety of foods. And it was only until you guys focused on us looking at one baboon rather than the community, the troop of them, and focusing on their diets and how they would actually end up having a fairly consistent and very consistent macronutrient spread, despite having all different foods over a 30-day period. And that's something that people still can't seem to understand and can't, work out, because they are having quite a varied diet and their macros do vary so much. And it's something that you speak about with the protein leverage.
So that's exactly right. And we showed it not only in Stella the baboon, and that was remarkable. Stella ate over a 30-day period, when she was watched by a PhD student, Kaylee Johnson. She's watched continuously throughout the feeding day for 30 consecutive days. So that's a long chunk of diet that Kaylee was able to record. And when we analyzed the data, we found that even though she had eaten on 90 different foods, many different foods on a given day, and different food combinations on different days, on each day and across that 30-day period, the balance of her macros remained remarkably consistent. 1 part of protein to 5 parts of non-protein energy, fats and carbohydrates. She didn't have a diet book. She didn't have diet calculators. She didn't have a degree in nutrition science. All she had was those same 5 appetites that our own species and every other species we've studied possesses. And no species other than ours in the history of life has ever had a diet book or had a need for a diet, because they know instinctively how to select a balanced diet. Now, we've done experiments on our own species, and we've also analyzed data from population studies, from diet surveys, showing unequivocally that our own species has that same capability. We've shown in an experiment in Jamaica, for example, with volunteers where we provided them with foods whose compositions we exactly knew because we had manipulated the macronutrient composition of the menus that we provided them. We showed that over the experimental period, even though they're selected from a range of different compositions, from 25% protein right the way down to 10% protein, what we found is consistently they ate over the experimental period a diet of 15% protein. And that shows that we too have the capability of selecting a diet that has the appropriate balance of macronutrients.
So for our listeners that potentially use fitness trackers to track their macronutrient intake and log their calories and so on, what are the things that they should be pretty much looking at, or what are the things that they should disregard and allow their body to, I guess, regulate themselves? Is there certain things that you recommend that they should be focusing on?
Look, that's an important thing. I mean, one thing we need to realize is that we are not operating within the natural environment that our appetites evolved to operate in. Unlike Stella the baboon and the other species that we've studied that are operating within the right environments. We've changed our food environment in ways that make it much more difficult and in fact pose fundamental risks to us, as we'll get to discuss a bit later probably. Fundamental risks to us. We've changed the nature of our food environment such that in effect, those evolved appetites can trip us up, not because there's anything wrong with us as individuals biologically, but because the food environment has become so distorted. So it really is a challenge, and I can see your listeners, I can see the logic behind, and it's a great thing. They're paying attention to what they're eating. They're maintaining fitness. They're trying to get it right. There are simple ways to do that. By changing your environment rather than changing your behavior in very complex ways, monitoring. Nutrition and diet should not be a complex mathematical equation. It should be a fun and automatic and instinctive thing that we do and we get right. And that is the aim of this book that we've written, is to try to explain why that is, to place our own species in the context of all the others that we've studied, and present some kind of clarity on why it is that despite the fact that we have this amazing evolved biology, we get it so wrong in modern food environments.
And that's something that's really interesting because we hear it all the time from our members and our clients, and I'm sure our listeners can relate to how they say to us, well, we know what to eat, but we just can't do it, or we know there's certain things they need to be having into their diet, but they sometimes want that clarification or to make sure they're on the right track. But a lot of the times they're on the right track. And when we give that personalized nutrition, we're not giving anything that's groundbreaking or anything that's never been done before. A lot of it is quite, simple and basic, and that's how we like to keep it.
Personalized nutrition is, of course, it's a fantastic concept. The real challenge is, though, firstly establishing what that personalized recommendation should be. And this, in some cases, it's very clear. If people have, for example, diabetes or other medical conditions, then it's relatively straightforward to personalized nutrition. For most people, I would suggest that personalized nutrition isn't the biggest priority at this stage. There's another level down from that, or an increase in generality. Personalized nutrition is very difficult to follow, to implement. Studies have been done demonstrating that even nutrition students struggle to follow personalized nutrition regimes because it makes eating a complex process of calculating things, and it takes discipline, rather. It takes the fun out of eating, and that's not always easy to do, especially in a busy world that we live in today. But another concept is stratified nutrition, where this is nutrition that is recommended for for similar groups of people, age groups, males versus female, whether you're very active or whether you're not very active. That's another level. And it's also an important level because, of course, our nutrient needs do change with different circumstances like age and activity levels and so forth. But by and large, I think that a healthy diet, there are ways to improve your diet that will apply to almost all of us, very straightforward ways. And the most straightforward way is to concentrate on eating real and whole foods, to follow effectively the main message of the Australian and other national dietary guidelines, which is to reduce or eliminate as far as possible the intake of highly processed factory-made foods that don't come from fields, and but what they come from is they come from industrial factories. Those foods have been designed by food engineers not to improve our health, but to improve the profits of the corporations that sell them. And these are the highly processed foods that have been a major issue, that have their introduction, their spread across the globe has correlated very tightly with the rise of the obesity epidemic and many of the associated diseases. It's not complex to be able to focus your nutrition scheme around one category of foods that is very easily recognizable and distinguished from the other category, which are real whole foods, things that are farmed and minimally processed. That's a simple equation compared to trying to track individual nutrients and match those to very highly specific nutrient needs.
Exactly. And that's something that we see. We either have the two scenario. Well, there's two main things. Is one is, the diet probably works because you eliminated the processed foods, like you mentioned, and those things are the things that are going to have a great impact. And that's something that we see all the time with our members, and something that our listeners can probably relate to quite a lot is when you eliminate processed foods, because they are so high in, energy, and they lack protein, and they're quite diluted in protein. It does affect your appetite, and it does not it's not satiating as having whole foods, like you mentioned.
So that's exactly the point. So one of the things that we discuss at length in the book is our research demonstrating why it is that these processed foods lead to energy overconsumption and obesity. And if you look at, so the one study that we did with a group in Brazil with Yuri Martinez and Professor Carlos Monteiro, a public health nutritionist, is we analyzed the American Diet Survey data consisting of about 9,000 people. And what Yuri did was to split those people into 5 groups based on the percentage of energy contributed per day to their diets by these highly processed, ultra-processed foods. And that percentage range, the lowest percentage was, and this is quite a shocking statistic in its own right, the lowest percentage of energy, the lowest group had 32% of their energy that they ate on a daily basis contributed by these highly processed foods. The highest group had 80% of the energy from these foods. That's eating almost exclusively machine-produced, engineer designed foods rather than natural foods. Now, what we also found in that analysis is that as the percentage of protein as the percentage of ultra processed foods in the diets of American people went up, the percentage of protein went down. And this demonstrates very strongly something that we already know about processed foods, is that they are low in protein relative to fats and carbohydrates. Now, what our research has shown is that the way that we and many other species, we've studied other primates in the wild do this as well, the way that we deal with protein dilution in that way is to eat more of the food to get the same amount of protein. And the reason for that is that the strongest of our appetites is the appetite for protein. So you dilute protein in the diet, we will eat the same amount of protein, but we have to eat more fats and carbohydrates to get it. And that is what we found in the analysis with Yuri, is that as the percentage of processed foods went up, the percentage of protein went down, the total energy eaten went up, and the amount of protein eaten remains constant. So no impact on protein eaten, but to get the same amount of protein from ultra-processed foods, people had to eat a whole lot more energy. And that is the mechanism, it's called the protein leverage effect, through which dilution of our diets by these machine-produced ultra-processed foods causes us to, it's one of the mechanisms, causes us to overeat energy and become associated with obesity. And the other mechanisms, they're also very low in fiber. And fiber, like protein, is another dietary component that satiates us, is that it satisfies us. So you lower protein and you remove fiber, and you've got a double threat in terms of not good. Yeah.
It's definitely not good. So that was the protein leverage hypothesis, or the protein leverage theory that you guys came up with. And you actually mentioned in the book how it actually got paused, the study that you published. It was paused as you were trying to come up with it, and how prior to you and Stephen discovering this research, that the paper had actually slowed your publication down.
Yeah, it wasn't easy to get the paper published because the implications was so clear and the mechanism was so simple, and we were trying to publish it in a different field than our own. We work more on the animal side of things, and we were publishing it in the human nutrition community. And human nutritionists who had been working on these problems, for their entire careers couldn't reconcile the fact that such a simple mechanism that comes from animal studies might actually provide a solution to the problem that hadn't been found before. And it's a very different solution. It's counterintuitive. What it tells us is that we're eating too much fat and carbohydrates, not because we have strong appetites for those nutrients, but because we have a stronger appetite for the third macronutrient, which is protein. So it's completely counterintuitive, and it took a bit of time to get accepted. Another reason it's counterintuitive is that if you look at the statistics of the period, the diet, if you look at global diets or American or Australian diets over the period that obesity has increased, protein intake has remained constant, but what's gone up is fat and carbohydrate intake. Now, that makes it look like protein plays no role in the obesity epidemic. How can it be playing a role in the obesity epidemic if it hasn't changed and we've become fat? But in actual fact, that's the point. The reason it hasn't changed is because human beings regulate their protein so strongly that they've ensured it hasn't changed. But in order to keep it similar in a world that has been increasingly diluted by fats and carbohydrates, we've had to increase those two nutrients. So it's simple, but it's also counterintuitive, and that got the publication delayed.
You see how the main difference between animal nutrition and human nutrition is the eating behaviors that we mentioned earlier, and how the eating patterns are the biggest thing that's going to affect someone's food behaviors. Because although we might have access to all the foods that we want, we actually are being bombarded with advertising and with heaps in the power of marketing and these big companies that, it's so hard for someone to navigate through this.
It is, it's a very complex world that we live in. Exactly.
Extremely complex.
It's very complex. And at some level, of course, energy overconsumption and obesity are very, very complex. They're very complex things. As you've mentioned, it's not just appetites. These appetites have to operate in this incredibly complex world where we are presented, when we go, the human equivalent of foraging, when we go to a supermarket to buy our weekly food, we're presented with all of these signals, we're bombarded with signals other than our appetite systems that have to do with cheap prices, that have to do with messaging on packages that imply subtly health benefits from eating those foods. They have to do with a huge clutter of information. And it's no wonder that noise drowns out the clear signals that are sent to us by our appetites. And part of protein leverage is it's a very simple mechanism, but to implement it requires that we make pretty radical steps in our environment to avoid those countervailing those opposing forces that are beckoning us to eat things that in actual fact will not be positive, but will be negative in terms of our health. And that's a complex task. It's a difficult one to solve. It's an easy one to understand, but it's a difficult one to solve.
When we look at all the things that are involved, like the power of marketing and how companies use very fancy terms and they call things light and spell them LITE and focus on low fat, but it's not really that much lower in calories. How can our listeners navigate through eating behaviors, and how can they ensure that they're going to be focusing on those 5 key appetites, but also make sure they're not so persuaded by the power of marketing? And it's such a tricky thing to navigate.
So it is a tricky thing to navigate, but at one level, at another level, it's relatively simple. And that is, as we explain in the book, the issue has to do with the way that we've changed this and commercialized our food environment in a way that other people benefit more from the foods that we eat than what we benefit. So it's commercial profit rather than health. And so what we've got to think about is, what can we do about that environment and that food environment that we've created for ourselves? It's an important but a long-term and an immensely challenging task to, I think, to reshape our food system in a way that delivers a much more natural experience or environment within which our appetites can operate. So that's the bad news, but it doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means that it's a challenge that is beyond any one of us. But there is a challenge that each and every one of us can meet, and that's what I would recommend in terms of navigating this complex environment. And that is to ensure that your local food environment, the one that you do have control over, your home food environment, is shaped in a way that when your appetites want to do their business, when you're feeling hungry, they're exposed to the kind of foods that they can work with. And so my motto is, shop with your brain, minimize the amount of processed junk you take into your house, and eat with your appetites, so that when you're hungry and you reach for something, what you're reaching for is you're reaching for food that is actually going to satisfy your appetites as well as your health, rather than food that's going to satisfy, in some respects, your appetites, but mostly what it's going to satisfy is the profit KPIs of the commercial companies that are producing this stuff. And we can all regulate our home food environment. It's not about not eating processed foods at all. Look, it's fun. Eating must be about fun. It's just not allowing processed foods, not eating them to the extent that they're displacing from your diet otherwise healthy foods. So another way of looking at it, it's not good to be told what not to do in terms of diet, but another way of looking at it is focus on eating whole foods. If you're hungry for something, real foods, go for a real food. What that'll do is automatically reduce the amount and proportion of processed foods in your diet, because once your appetite is satisfied, your appetite is satisfied. The risk is when you expose hungry appetites to processed food.
Choosing things not because they want to eat it, but because those foods aren't satiating enough, and how you mentioned then just buying things that are satiating and building a diet that you can control at home, which is so true. But it sounds so simple, and nutrition is simple, and I find it tends to get reinvented, or people try and reinvent it so much so that it no longer works, and people try and put these specific models in where it's either, you have to eliminate certain food groups or eliminate certain types of food from your diet in order to improve your health outcomes, which is not what you're trying to promote in the book at all. It's just actually, listening to your body in a way that your diet is satiating.
So that's an important point. I must emphasize, though, that of course there are conditions where you really do need proper medical advice. If they're eating disorders or situations of chronic obesity or diabetes or whatever, it's not just a question. I'm speaking about avoiding those conditions rather than treating those conditions. Those conditions need specific medical and dietary advice around them. But the big issue, I think, is to avoid them before they happen.
So when we talk about how we have innate drives and how there's the 5 appetites, something that's really interesting is how we all have these same biological drives in our body. And people talk about all the time, well, you're not a baboon. How is this data, how are people going to take on this data? And how do you influence people to get them to take your advice on, and how eat like the animals is actually a real thing?
We're not like a mouse, or we're not like a baboon in some ways, but in other ways we are like a mouse and we are like a baboon. We have the same physiological mechanisms. We have the same nutrient signaling pathways, maybe configured in slightly different ways. But if you look across the animal kingdom and you see that very broadly, especially close relatives of ours, like the primates that I study in the wild, if you see that they're behaving in certain ways that are very similar to the ways that we behave, and you know that they have physiology and behavioral mechanisms very similar to those that we have, that is very strong evidence that we should be taking seriously the kinds of lessons that we're learning from that species in their natural environment to infer what our biology would be operating in our former natural environments. That's the one way. The other way you can do it is you can perform experiments. I've told you earlier about our experiment in Jamaica. What we did there is we exposed the experimental subjects to real foods, to proper food menus, not processed foods. And we showed that they too selected a balanced diet, just like Stella the baboon did. That's very powerful evidence. There's no reason to expect that we differ in those respects than what other species do. And then you've got population evidence. We know that populations that are exposed to healthy food environments, just like Stella the baboon and the other species we study, they all have healthy outcomes. I think populations like the Japanese Okinawans, for example, all populations, the Mediterranean blue zones that have eaten, historically at least, it's all changing now, but that have eaten healthy whole food diets have had immense longevity and immense health span, a very long health span. They've remained healthy into a late old age.
Well, you talk about the two pathways in your book, and how is there actually, you can have too much protein, and how you had a study with the blowflies and how you observed over their lifespan, which is a lot shorter than ours, where they would have a high concentration of protein and a low concentration of protein, and how that would lead to two outcomes, one which is long life and one that is focused for reproduction. So there's actually, obviously we know that there's an optimal amount of protein to be taken in by the body, and there's of course someone that can eat too much protein, and that can obviously have side effects of growth. Would you like to explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, that was a really interesting period in our research because, and again, it attests to the importance of looking at other species. What we noticed in many species is they have, like us, they have the strong protein appetite. And what the strong protein appetite means is that they will not, they'll remain hungry until they've eaten enough protein, but they will not eat more protein than what is enough. And this was a very strong effect, and we see it in many species. Gives rise then to the question of, and I was saying earlier on, that what these appetites do is they tell our behavior what our nutrient needs are. When we satisfied those needs, they do not cause us to eat anymore. And this gave rise to the question, why is it that these animals will eat a certain amount, but not more? We knew why they want to get their daily fill of protein, because they need amino acids. They can't store amino acids. They can't store protein in the way that they can store fat, for example. So on a daily basis, they needed the amino acids that their bodies require to produce muscle, enzymes, and all of the physiological uses that proteins are put to. But then the question, why didn't they eat more than that? And we've thought long and hard about this. And what we did know is there must be some really important reason. So we did an experiment on fruit flies, actually, in which we manipulated.
I said blowflies, didn't I? Sorry.
You said blowflies.
Sorry.
Fruit flies, in which we manipulated the diet, and we recorded for diets that varied widely in their protein to carbohydrate ratio, what the lifespan and what the reproductive output of these animals was associated with the individual diets that we gave each experimental group. And what we found was that the group that had lower protein to carbohydrate ratio had much longer lives. And as protein to carbohydrate ratio increased, lifespan decreased, but reproduction increased, reproductive output increased. And this, to some extent, explained the why it is that animals regulate protein, and humans do that strongly, because there are costs of overeating. If you're not in a reproductive state, overeating protein results in accelerated aging. And we've since shown this. It's known for nematode worms. We've shown it in mice, and there's good evidence that the same applies for our own species. So if too little protein is bad, that doesn't mean that any amount is good. The whole point about diet is that neither too little, too much, and that's the concept of dietary balance.
If we look at the future of nutrition in certain populations, you mentioned in the book, and you've traveled to places all around the world, including the Himalayas and island populations, and you've seen how processed foods are taking over and how they're emerging into areas where there were previously never any processed foods. So what is the future of nutrition, and how are we going to navigate as processed foods become the norm and eventually take over, or if they do take over, whole foods and certain things like that?
That's a really, really important question. That's one of the most important questions I see in my career at the moment. It's also a very complex and challenging question, because the powers behind the spread of these processed foods are immense. The corporate power that is driving this spread of ultra processed foods, and at the same time, it's not evil corporations doing something that harms populations for the sake of harming populations. The corporations are just doing their job, and doing that job well. And that is that they're selling foods that increase profits for their shareholders. So it's very, very complex. And the public themselves, it's not that they don't want to eat these foods. They do want to eat the foods, because the foods are designed specifically so that they want to eat the foods, because they are tasty. There's no doubt they're tasty. They are cheap. They are convenient. So you've got this public demand for the foods, and you've got the corporations fulfilling that demand. And so it's the interaction of those two groups that is driving the problem. And then you've got a third party in the equation, and that is government. Government, depending on the government and the politics, they might or might not regulate things, but it's very difficult for government to regulate against the might of these corporations, especially when at the same time the public feel that their choices are being restricted. So you've got this interplay between the government, you've got the industry, and you've got consumers. And each one is blaming everyone else for the problem. And the real challenge is that we need to set in place some kind of a forum and a mechanism where we can get together. Nobody wants the obesity epidemic on a scale that we've got it at the moment. The cost to society and individuals is immense. Nobody wants it. Industry doesn't want it. If industry could be offered ways of achieving their profit KPIs without driving environmental destruction and obesity epidemics in the way that they're doing at the moment, they will be the first to sign up for it. Governments are the same, and civil society is the same. So we need to have a forum in which we can sit back as a society and say, how are we going to find ways forward that are going to maintain the interests of all three groups, let industry have its commercial success, but not at the cost of health and the environment. And I think we need a different research approach for that.
Is that something that you're working on in the future?
Yes, we're at the University of Sydney. We are now putting together a very high-level group from across Australia and also globally to build a research institute for identifying ways of transforming our food systems in a way that does exactly what I've just explained. If we can identify the sticking points that are preventing us from doing anything constructive about this flood of processed food through our society and other societies that's wreaking havoc on health and environment. If we can identify the sticking points and then find ways by pooling the best minds from across the research community, together with members of the public, together with government, and together with industry, that is the only way that we can move forward. And this is an ecological approach. This relates to my core expertise as an ecologist, is that our food system, the one that we're speaking about, is an ecology like any other ecology, but it's just a very strange and distorted ecology. So ecosystems that I study in my non-human work are food systems, but they're natural food systems. And they operate in these kind of complex ways as well, but generally for better outcomes. What we need to do is apply a systems ecological approach to dealing with this society-wide problem.
Do you think that that's something that can actually be achieved? And it seems like such a monumental, I don't want to be negative, but it seems like such a massive task to actually do that. And with where you spoke about in the book, how, these processed foods are finding their ways into places that there were never previously any processed foods. And it is making a big part of the diet, and how, if the protein consumption continues to be diluted and, those snack food choices make up big parts of people's meals, it does change the landscape of nutrition and potentially can change it forever.
You're absolutely right. It's not trivial, and it might sound idealistic, but actually there's no option. What is the option? To leave things progressing in the way that they are? That is not an option.
No,
and
definitely not.
The things that make me confident about it, I mean, it's a daunting and it's a massive task, I agree. What makes me confident about it is, firstly, as I said previously, the stakes are so high. The cost of environmental degradation and these pandemics of poor health associated with poor diets and nutrition, it's immense. So there should be incentives there, and the incentives are there. Industry can see, the processed food industry can see the evidence mounting in the same way as the tobacco industry saw the evidence mounting, linking their products to lung cancer. There is a writing on the wall. And as I said, these aren't evil people. These are good people like you and me who want good outcomes. It's just that they're trapped working within a system where their KPIs have to do with selling more foods regardless of what the cost is to human health and the environment. So the will is there. You can offer a government a way of support, of maintaining a healthy economy with the benefit of a healthy environment and a healthy population. That's a no-brainer. So the stakes are very, very high. So that's the one thing that makes me confident that there is no alternative but to try a different approach. Every approach we've tried has not worked. The problem has become worse. It has not improved in any country. The other thing that makes me confident is that there are precedents showing that this kind of approach, where you work together with an academic community, civil society, government, and industry, where it works. I mean, tobacco smoking is one example. When I grew up, tobacco smoking, you'd sit on airplanes, people would be smoking cigarettes next to you. That's no longer the case. Something fundamental changed despite the power of the tobacco industry. And salt reduction is another. In some countries have seen tangible and really important success in reducing the intake of salt in their populations. They haven't done that by just telling people to eat less salt, because that doesn't work. They've done it through a high-level society-wide approach in the way that I'm suggesting we should do for the obesity epidemic.
So how long until we'll actually see some big changes with, these kind of government and then into organizational level changes for nutrition? Is there going to be, is that going to be in the next 3 to 5 years, or something for us to look forward to regulate? I'd hate for it to just be a sugar tax and then just increase the prices of all sugar foods, because we know that doesn't work.
No, we know that that doesn't work. Well, that's the thing. We're putting together this this community of researchers at the moment. And as I say, positive things already, there's an immense amount of research already out there that understands the parameters of this problem. It's just an issue of putting that information together and identifying out of that synthesis of what is already known, what more do we specifically need to focus on to move the show forward. So I'm optimistic. You know, things are already happening. It's just a question of having the right environment where they come together. And the first stage, as I say, is to look at what is known and why what is known has not worked to change the situation, and then find ways where you can have better effectiveness of this knowledge that all of our scientific and other research has produced. And regulation alone won't do it. As I've said, what you need is you need buy-in, you need alternatives produced by the food industry. Regulate against things is one thing, but you also need industry to be working in the right direction. And then you also need consumers to take, to play their part. You need behavior change. And not any one of these things isn't going to do it. They need to come together where the food environment changes, consumers use those changes in the food environment for selecting diets that are healthier than are being selected at the moment, and the food industry is providing the foods that, to make this possible. Really interesting question around that is, will there be processed foods or not processed foods? Are there ways to process foods for better health outcomes?
Oh yeah, who knows? It's going to be an exciting next few years to see what the engineers can come, nutritional engineers can come up with, and what kind of products they can make. But it seems like, I don't know if protein ice cream and those kind of products are the answer, and we know they're probably not the answer to solving people's problems.
I don't think they are. Why would you? It's a little bit like what's happened is, in addition to reducing fiber and reducing protein, displacing it with fats and carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates and fats in processed foods, micronutrients are also very low in processed foods. So what's happened is that industry has driven that, commercial interest has driven it. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got, it becomes a medical problem. So you get the medical industry sort of benefiting from this problem. And between the two, you've got the supplements industry that are selling people back the things that are taken out of real foods to make
extremely profitable.
So the whole thing becomes a sort of commercial extravaganza. There's a simple solution around it, and that is, don't eat as a large proportion of your diet these foods that have been manipulated in that way. Eat real foods. They have the vitamins. There's plenty of evidence suggesting that whole food diets are associated with much better health outcomes than processed food diets. So you avoid the medical side of things there as well. Simple solutions, not complex solutions, because drawing on further processing to deal with the problems of processing is not the same.
It seems, well, that's the current solution, isn't it? It's so interesting how things, you just mentioned with the supplements, it's such a popular thing. And we did a podcast previously, maybe about 20 episodes ago, talking about how supplements for a lot of people are not necessary if they're doing the right things to, if their diet is going to drive all those nutrients and vitamins up.
In most circumstances, you're right. Again, there might well be exceptions, but they are going to be the exception rather than the rule. By and large, you avoid the need for supplements if you eat a healthy whole food diet. And why don't you draw on your natural biology, your immaculately involved appetite systems that do the job for all other species and can for us as well, to enable them to lead you to that diet that cuts out the need for buying further processed things to remedy the problems of previously eaten processed things.
It's a really interesting discussion, and you can see how it is complicated, but there are aspects where it can be simplified, and the consumer can actually benefit quite a lot if they understand the variables and the mechanisms that are at play. Is there anything in the book in particular that you felt you could have, that you wanted to add in, that you left out, or is there anything in the book that you wanted to further elaborate on? I'm sure this thing could have been a lot longer than what it is.
Um, Anything that we left out of the book that we wanted to, the only thing I would have liked to have in the book, but it sort of would have diverted, and maybe that's, for a future project, is I discussed some of the species that we studied, especially in the wild. I've studied a large number of other species in the wild. Each of them have told their own story, many of which are relevant to our own species as well. And I would have liked maybe to have brought in a wider range of the studies that we've done in the wild, but maybe that's for a future book.
Extent
It is a
director's cut.
privilege and fascinating to be able to, yeah, as we said in the book, sometimes to see something clearly, you first have to look away. And that is what these studies of other species are about, is we've got problems and issues and really interesting points regarding our own situation, our own modern ecology. And if you look at other species and the diversity of ecological and biological situations that you see in them, and then you turn back to our own species, it all becomes so much clearer that we're not that different after all. We're different in some ways, but so too are each of the other species different from each of the others in some ways. What really differs for us is what we've done with our environments, the way that we've created environments that our biology is not really adapted to operating within.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. Now, where can we find any more information about Eat Like the Animals, apart from people reading the book, if they want to get in contact with you? Or usually people plug themselves at the end, but we encourage all our listeners to. My one has the posted notes in there, but I don't know, your copy might not come with the posted notes. Eat Like the Animals. It's available. You said now it's recently available in paperback in the UK under the 5 Appetites.
Yep, that's in the UK, and it's available from any good bookstore here as well, or from the online retailers. And I'm very happy for people to contact me. In fact, I enjoy that. I enjoy discussion. It's what the book is about, is engaging with the broader community outside of the expert field of nutrition and nutritional ecology and the health sciences. People can feel free to contact me. Via email is the best way. You could, if you like, to put my email on the website.
Definitely, I'll put it here. It'll be on the screen. Awesome.
In fact, it'd be interesting to hear people's perspectives on the stuff that we've discussed today.
Of course. Thank you so much for sharing your time, David. And we hope our listeners enjoyed hearing about Eat Like the Animals. If you haven't already checked the book out, please make sure you guys check the book out. I'll have links in the description of the video. And of course, there'll be links if you're listening on Spotify as well. You'll be able to hear and see all about the book. It's also available in audiobook as well as hard copy.